Industrialization is the development of industries within a certain country and or region. So, how did all of this industry stuff take off in the first place? It took off within the mid-1700s in Europe, and it took off because of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was switching from an agricultural society to a more industrial society, meaning that agricultural, more farming, to more industrial stuff, like mining for raw materials, energy extraction, and how did this all benefit Europe? Well, it really didn't in the first place. There was really bad economic panic, and the Industrial Revolution slowly started to diffuse throughout Europe, and slowly started to diffuse to international powers. Then finally it diffused to other parts of the world. Seen here is the diffusion of industrialization in the world. The situation and the site factors. I will first be speaking to you about the situation factors that affect industrialization. Basically, how much it takes from one product to be shipped to another specific place and how much it really costs. The farther something is shipped, the more it costs. So industries really have to focus on the inputs in the markets to figure out where they place their factories. This is called proximity to input and proximity to markets. This is when the optimal plant location is near the input, because raw material transportation cost weighs more than the transportation cost of the product to the consumer. And this goes with bulk reducing industries, because inputs weigh more than the final products. Plant location is near the market to make transportation costs reduce. And this contrasts with proximity to markets. It's basically the other way around. When the plant location is near the market, because raw material transportational cost is less than the transportational cost of the product to consumer. And this goes with bulk gaining industries, because the product gains volume or weight during the actual production, and the factories want to locate more towards the market to reduce transportational costs. This will be 4 types of transportation that all industry uses. And this will be and in that order is the cheapest. So, first one being trucks. This is for short distances from state to state. Next will be trains. This is from coast to coast, mostly used for in-the-country type of deals. Next will be ships. This is the lowest cost for shipping from country to country. And next will be air. And these are very for small bulk things. The site factors is the cost resulting from the unique characteristics of a location. Beginning with these site factors, I will begin with labor. This is the most important on a global scale. Minimizing these labor costs is most important to industries. Capital. Manufacturers usually borrow money to establish new factories or expand existing ones. And the ability to borrow money has greatly influenced the distribution of industry in developing countries. Next, I'll be talking about land. Lots must be large enough to accommodate these large, efficient, contemporary one-story buildings, mostly available in suburban and rural locations, and tends to be relatively cheaper than land in the city. Textile and apparels. Now, the production of textiles, which is woven fabrics, and the production of apparel, which is clothing, generally requires low-skilled, low-wage labor jobs. And most of the spending is primarily in low-wage countries, such as China, and the majority of apparel weaving happens in highly clustered low-wage countries, and that would be China and India, while they're changing. And this would be because of the emerging industrial regions. Because some manufacturers are locating in places where prevailing wages are lower than in the traditional industrial regions. This is most likely the transnational corporations, because they have embraced using low-cost labor in developing countries. Now, the new international division of labor refers to the selective transfer of production operations requiring highly skilled workers to factories located in developed countries, and those requiring little skill to factories located in developing countries. The Mexico and NAFTA agreement. This is when the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, aka NAFTA, eliminated most barriers to moving goods among Mexico, the US, and Canada since 1994. And Mexico attracts labor-intrusive industries because of its relatively low-cost labor and its proximity to the US. And these plants in Mexico near the US border are known as maquiladoras. Now that I've talked about industrialization, let's get into development. Development is the extent to which human and natural resources interact in a certain area or country and has been used to its full potential. Development is measured by a metric system created by the UN called the Human Development Index, which is the HDI. It is dependent on 3 factors: density, standard of living, the access to knowledge, and long and healthy life. And the countries go into 4 different groups. Level of development ranging from developed, very high, to developing, very low. UN measures standard of living based on two functions. The first one being GNI, or gross national incomes, and is the value of the outputs of goods and services produced in our country annually, including money that leaves and enters the country. Now, GDP, which is very similar, except it doesn't really account for the money entering and leaving the country. And this stands for gross domestic product. And the second one would be purchasing power parity, or PPP. This is the cost of living adjustment made to the GNI. The UN considers good health to be an important measure of development. Main health indicator contribution to the HDI is life expectancy. The average life expectancy is global average is 70 years. The developed country is 80 years, and developing countries is 68 years. Access to knowledge. The UN considers years of schooling to be one of the most critical measurements of an individual and their ability to gain the needed access to knowledge needed for development. So, the quantity of schooling around the world. For globally is 7 years, developing countries is 6 years, and for developed countries is 11 years. And then for the extended years, which is college, the developing countries is 11 years, and for the developed countries it's 16 years. Quality of schooling. In the pupil to teacher ratio. Globally, for every one teacher there is 24 students. For developing countries, for every one teacher there is 26 students. And for developed countries, for every one teacher there is 14 students. Now for the literacy rate. For developed countries, it's above 99%. For developing countries, it's between 70 and 90%. The UN created the Gender Inequality Index, the GII, that is based on multiple metrics. The first one being empowerment. This is defined as the ability of women to achieve improvements in status. This can either be percentage of seats held by women in the national legislative or the percentage of women who have completed high school. Next is the labor force. Female labor force participation rate defined as a percentage of women holding full-time jobs outside of the home. Reproductive health. This is maternal mortality ratio and the adolescent fertility ratio. Gender equality has almost declined in almost every single country since 1990s. The greatest improvements happening in Southwest Asia and North Africa. These developing countries, they really want to be developed. They have to choose one of the two paths to promote development. The first one being self-sufficiency. This is when countries encourage domestic production of goods, discourage foreign ownership of businesses and resources, and protect their businesses from international competition. The second is international trade. This is when countries open themselves up to foreign investment and international trade, hostile models. So, these have 5 key points. The first one being the traditional society. This is marked by a very high percentage of the people engaged in agriculture and a high percentage of the national wealth allocated to non-productive activities, such as the military. The second is the preconditions for takeoff. This is when the elite group initiates an innovative economic activities that ultimately stimulate an increase in productivity. The third is takeoff. This is rapid growth is generated in a limited number of economic activities, such as textiles. The fourth one is to drive maturity. This is when modern technology pervades from the few takeoff industries to other economic sectors. Final is the age of mass consumption. This is marked by the shift from heavy industries such as steel to consumer goods. 2 groups of countries following the international trade approach. The first one being the 4 Asian dragons. This will be South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. Their development is promoted by the producing of a handful of manufacturing goods, such as clothing and electronics. The second group would be petroleum-rich Arabian Peninsula states. This will be Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, and the UAE. So, the rising oil prices beginning in the 1970s transformed these countries into becoming more developed as the progresses on. Financing development. Finance comes from 2 primary sources. The first one being direct investment by transnational corporations, and the second one being loans from banks and international organizations. Now, the foreign direct investment, or the FDI, is defined by investment made by a foreign company in the economy of another country. Major source of FDI are transnational corporations. Loans. 2 major lenders to developing countries is the World Bank, which includes the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the IBRD, and the International Development Association, the IDA. The IBRD provides loans to countries to reform public administration and legal institutions, develop and strengthen financial institutions, and implement transportation and social service projects. The IDA provides support to countries considered too risky to receive loans from the IBRD. The other major lender is the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. The IMF provides loans to countries that experience balance of payments problems that threaten expansion of international trade. Emmanuel Wallerstein hoisted a world systems analysis that unified the world economy, with developed countries forming an inner core area, whereas developing countries occupy the peripheral locations. Now, developing countries in the periphery have less access to a world center of consumption, communications, wealth, and power are clustered in the core. Closing the gap. Progress in reducing the gap between developed and developing countries varied infant mortality rate. The gap has narrowed from 17 to 6 per thousand in developed countries, from 107 to 44 in developing countries. The next one would be a life expectancy. This gap has not narrowed at all. And the last one being GNI per capita. The gap in wealth between developed and developing countries has widened significantly.